It sounds like for your clinic, for your agency, it was a shift.
Yeah, we very much had to
So
make a
like
shift.
what does
Yeah.
that look like? How do you, if you decide, okay, this sounds really good, I really want to be part of this, I want to start shifting this. Maybe you say, oh well, yeah, I've already been doing a lot of this work in my personal life, and this sounds great. I want to bring it to my company. I want
Yeah.
my staff to be able to access it. Like, what would you recommend some of the first steps being?
So I would recommend that as many BCBAs as you can become trained in these practices, but with the specific workshops that Dr. Hayes has put together. And he's done this with Dr. Belisle and Dr. Dixon. So he partners with several people, but he goes around the world. He also has virtual workshops. They're on Praxis. But I would highly recommend that. They're not cheap, but they're also not expensive. Like when I look at the investment now, it's great, right? Because it's been so impactful for how we practice and how it's just been beneficial in my own life to where it just hasn't it it hasn't felt that expensive, if that makes sense, but it is expensive if the trainings are. But I would say have as many people as you can experience that training in those workshops. And he has an immersive or an immersion one, and he has one that's kind of like for beginners, like an introduction. They're both great, and they're both incredibly helpful because if you can have your supervisors practicing these things and practicing these skills and constantly talking about it, I would say that's also one of the biggest shifts that we had was that we just were constantly talking about ACT then, constantly talking about our values, constantly talking about like, oh man, way to engage in the present moment, like, right? Like, so we were really going for like that feedback part, like the feedback and response section of BST when it came down to it, so that we were recognizing that we were practicing it, we would reinforce that behavior. And so now it is one of those things where I would say that it's the hardest shift is with our new employees because they don't trust it. They don't trust that we are not a dishonest employer. And because there are a lot of dishonest employers out there who are like, no, 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 I really want you to take that time off for yourself. And then they get penalized for it. Right?
Yeah.
Or they'll say, no, I really want you to do this, but, and there's still some sort of like, I got to put you on
Right.
coaching because you're not meeting this
Right.
KPI. And
Strings
you're like,
attached. Yeah.
there's always a struggle. Like, but with us, like, we're like, oh, okay, cool. Like, I'm looking at somebody's schedule right now and they're just not available at all today. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's fine. And then I have somebody else who's not available until 1. And I have another person who's not available after 3, right? Like, so we accommodate these types of things and these types of requests because we also recognize that, and I think this is because my husband and I both came from the restaurant world or the gig world, right? Where like you can make your own schedule. You can't be like, ooh, I made enough money in tips last night, so let me release my shift tomorrow so that I don't have to work today. But that was so great for our mental health, right? And so we recognize that you're not always going to know when you need a mental health break.
Yes, that's really big. You know, that was one of the things that we were shifting to, and I had a hard time like figuring that out of how to do it. So the way that I approached it was, you know, let me know before you need it, right? Like if you're starting to feel, because we talked about like the, you know, feeling the signs of burnout, and there again, like as I look back to that and know now what
That's
I know
almost
now,
impossible,
it's
right?
like how can you, like, especially if you don't have those skills already, number one, of you know,
You aren't even feeling the burnout. You
that
are so numb to it,
that's
right?
why it happens. And sometimes the burnout shows up as a fever and a sore throat, right? And so,
100%.
yeah, and sometimes you just literally just wake up one morning and you just don't have the mental capacity to get out of bed. And
No, you wake up and honestly, like when I was a behavior technician, you would wake up sometimes in tears
yeah, yeah,
because you're like, I
I
can't do this today.
I
I am
can't
not in the
exactly.
space to do it.
Exactly. And you know, I have the most of my experiences working in home. And I have some clinic experience, but more as an owner versus a active and play, right? It was like all in home for me. And there were some challenging homes to step into.
Yeah.
And where I would just absorb all of the behavior. I mean, not all the behavior, all of the energy. Just in,
Yes.
I would just walk in the, and this was, I couldn't, this was like years and years ago. And I didn't have the understanding of what was happening, but I knew I was walking into a house and I would just like absorb it all. And it was, I was great. I feel like I was a really great tech. I
Right.
did a great job. People liked me, families liked me, but at what
It burned
cost
you
to
out.
me?
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
You
That's
know,
exactly what happens.
I left. You know, I would leave the session and maybe it would be multiple sessions or multiple weeks that it would build up, and then you couldn't
You
couldn't
couldn't.
function.
Right. That's what happens. And like, I think this is what we forget too, because behavior analysts don't like to talk about this, but what ends up happening when you ignore those signals in your body, physiological responses start to happen.
Yeah.
That's when the sore throat and the runny nose show up. That's when suicidal ideations can show up for some women and some men, right? Because it's difficult. We're in a position where we take on so much of a burden, right? Oh my gosh, I can't remember who wrote this book, so I'll have to find it again. But there is a book about trauma stewardship, which is essentially about you're providing so much compassion towards others that you start to become numb to yourself, and you also start to become numb to the environment, right? And then what ends up happening are those extreme behaviors. And you're like, where did this come from? It came out of the blue, right? Like our kids. It didn't come out of the blue. There were so many ignored signals. All of these antecedents were happening. All of these behaviors were signaling that there was something bad about to happen. We just ignored them. So it's crazy too when you think about it, and how detrimental that type of avoidance is.